5 signs of a stupid person in old age. Have you ever felt like life is slipping away, not because of time, but because of unseen barriers you've unknowingly built for yourself? Could the habits you've developed over the years, habits that once served you well, now be silently working against you, holding you back from the joy, connection, and fulfillment you deserve? Aging isn't just about getting older, it's about how you live these years. Yet many people unknowingly fall into patterns that lead to isolation, stagnation, and regret. The tragedy? They don't even realize it's happening. But what if you could change that? In this video, we're uncovering 5 hidden habits that often go unnoticed, but have a profound impact on your happiness, relationships, and personal growth. These are not just theories, they are real, lived experiences. You'll hear powerful, eye-opening stories of people who unknowingly trapped themselves in these habits and how they broke free. This is your moment to reflect, to grow, and to take back control of your best years. Stay with me until the end, because what you learn today could change the course of the rest of your life. If this resonates with you, comment 1 below, and let's begin this journey together. 1. A closed mind refusing to embrace new ideas. It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. Epictetus. There's an old story about Socrates, the great philosopher of ancient Greece. One day, a proud scholar approached him, eager to impress with his knowledge. The man spoke endlessly, boasting of all he had learned. Socrates listened patiently, then lifted an empty cup. He began to pour tea, filling the cup to the brim, and then kept pouring. The tea spilled over, drenching the table. The scholar jumped back in shock. "Why do you keep pouring? The cup is already full," he exclaimed. Socrates smiled. "Exactly," he said. "How can I teach you anything if your mind is already full? The greatest mistake we make as we age is assuming we have nothing left to learn. But a mind that stops learning is like a river that stops flowing. It becomes stagnant, lifeless. And too often we let that stagnation take hold without even realizing it." I knew a man named Walter. In his younger days he was sharp, resourceful, always ahead of his time. He built a good life with his hands, providing for his family through sweat and skill. He took pride in what he knew, and rightly so. But as the years passed, something changed. The world around him kept moving, but Walter? He stayed right where he was, convinced that the old ways were the best ways. "I don't need all that newfangled nonsense," he'd say when his kids tried to teach him about technology. "We got along just fine without it." His grandson Danny had moved across the country, and his daughter Ellen often asked him to try video calling. Walter refused. "If they want to see me, they can visit," he'd grumble. But as time passed, the visits became fewer. The house that once echoed with laughter became quiet, filled only with the sound of the television and the occasional creak of his rocking chair. One night, as he sat alone at his kitchen table, he stared at the empty seat across from him. His wife Margaret had been gone for years now. He used to tell himself he liked the quiet. But on nights like this, when the silence stretched too long, he wasn't so sure anymore. Only one day his daughter showed up with a laptop. "Just try it once, Dad, for Danny." Walter huffed but relented. The first time he saw his grandson's face on that screen, something in him cracked open. Danny was no longer a distant voice on the phone. He was right there, grinning, waving, showing off a drawing he made in school. "Grandpa! I can finally show you my dinosaurs!" Walter swallowed hard, his gruff exterior melting away. He had been so certain he didn't need this, so convinced it was useless. And yet, here he was, feeling warmth spread through his chest at the sight of that little boy's face. Read that day on, Walter's evenings were no longer filled with just TV. He learned to use video calls, even if it took him a few tries to get the hang of it, and for the first time in years, his home wasn't empty anymore. But here's the thing, the technology wasn't what mattered. It was what it allowed him to do, to stay connected, to remain part of his grandson's life, instead of just a name he barely remembered. One evening, after another long conversation with Danny, Walter sat back in his chair and chuckled to himself. "All these years I thought I knew everything. Turns out I was just an old fool who didn't know what he was missing." How many of us do what Walter did? How often do we dismiss things simply because they feel unfamiliar? We tell ourselves we don't need to change, don't need to adapt. But what are we really saying? We're saying we don't need to grow. And the moment we stop growing, we start fading. You see, keeping an open mind isn't about abandoning everything you know, it's about allowing room for new experiences to enhance what you already have. It's easy to assume the world has nothing left to teach us, that the younger generation is lost, that things were better back then. But what if, just what if, there are things today that could make your life richer, fuller? What if there are new ways to connect, to learn, to experience joy if only you are open to them? There's an old saying, the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. The world is always changing, always moving. We can either move with it or let it leave us behind. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather bend than break. How many of us do what Walter did? How often do we dismiss things simply because they feel unfamiliar? We tell ourselves we don't need to change, don't need to adapt. But what are we really saying? We're saying we don't need to grow. And the moment we stop growing, we start fading. You see, keeping an open mind isn't about abandoning everything you know. It's about allowing room for new experiences to enhance what you already have. It's easy to assume the world has nothing left to teach us, that the younger generation is lost, that things were better back then. But what if, just what if, there are things today that could make your life richer? What if there are new ways to connect, to learn, to experience joy if only you were open to them? There's an old saying, the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. The world is always changing, always moving. We can either move with it or let it leave us behind. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather bend than break. 2. Blaming others. Avoiding responsibility. He that is good for making excuses is seldom good for anything else. Benjamin Franklin, a long time ago a man came to the great philosopher Confucius filled with frustration. Master, my life is full of disappointment. My sons do not respect me, my friends have abandoned me, and fate has been cruel. Nothing is as it should be. Confucius looked at the man and said, before you blame the road for being rough, ask yourself if you have chosen the wrong path. The man frowned. What do you mean? The philosopher replied, you call life unfair, but have you not played a role in your own misfortune? You expect others to walk toward you, yet you never take a step toward them. You say your friends have abandoned you, but when was the last time you reached out with kindness instead of bitterness? A wise man does not wait for the world to change, he changes himself first. The man left in deep thought. He had spent his life pointing fingers at others, never realizing that the true source of his suffering was within himself. And isn't that the same mistake so many of us make? My name is Margaret. I am 78 years old, and if you had met me a few years ago, you would have met a woman full of anger, bitterness, and regret. I used to sit in my armchair, staring at the phone that never rang, the door that never opened. My children had their own lives and they rarely visited. My friends had drifted away. Holidays passed in silence, birthdays forgotten, and I was furious. After everything I've done for them, I'd muttered to myself. All those years of sacrifice, of love, of putting them first, and this is how they repay me? They don't even care. I blamed my children, I blamed my friends, I blamed the world, but never once did I blame myself. Then, one day, something happened that changed everything. It was Christmas Eve, the loneliest night of the year. I sat by the window, watching as families gathered in the houses across the street. Laughter spilled from open doors, the warm glow of celebration filling the cold winter night. I looked at my own home, silent, dark, empty, and then I saw her. Across the street, my neighbor, Helen, a woman in her 80s, stood at her doorstep waving goodbye to her children and Her face was glowing, she looked full of life, full of love, and for the first time I wondered, what was she doing right that I was doing wrong? So the next morning, I went to see her. Helen, I said, how do you do it? How do you keep your family so close? Don't they ever forget you? She laughed, shaking her head. Forget me? Oh, honey, they would if I let them. I stared at her. What do you mean? She patted my hand. I don't wait for them to come to me, I go to them, I call them just to say hello. I send little notes, funny stories and reminders that I love them. I don't expect them to do all the work of staying connected. Relationships aren't owed, they are nurtured. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. All these years I had waited for them to call, waited for them to visit, waited for them to prove they loved me. But what had I done? Had I called them just to say I missed them? Had I reached out without bitterness, without making them feel guilty? Had I made an effort to stay part of their lives? The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. That very night I did something I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone and called my daughter. Not to complain, not to guilt-trip her, just to say, "Hi, sweetheart, I love you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" And in that moment I realized she had been afraid to call me. Afraid that I'd be angry, afraid of hearing resentment in my voice, afraid of feeling like a disappointment. For years I had been pushing her away without even realizing it. So I did something I should have done long ago. I apologized. I told her I had spent too many years blaming others instead of taking responsibility for my own happiness. I told her I wanted to be part of her life, not as a burden but as a blessing. She cried. I cried. And do you know what happened next? She invited me over for dinner. That was 5 years ago. Since then I've rebuilt my relationships, not just with my daughter but with my grandchildren, my friends, and even myself. I stopped waiting. I stopped blaming. Instead, I started living, and you know what? Happiness came back into my life. Not because the world changed, but because I changed. And if I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, it would be this. Stop looking at what others aren't doing for you and start asking what you can do for them. Because when you take responsibility for your own happiness, everything else starts to fall into place. So now I want to ask you, have you ever caught yourself waiting for someone else to fix what's missing in your life? Have you ever blamed others for your loneliness, your struggles, your disappointments, only to realize later that you held the power to change things all along? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your experiences. Your wisdom, your stories, your reflections, they matter. And if this story spoke to you, like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe, because the truth is, it's never too late to stop blaming and start living. 3. Arrogance. Thinking you know it all. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor. And it is not the man who knows little, but the man who refuses to learn who is a fool. Seneca, Old Church Bird. There's an old Cherokee tale about a wise elder and a proud young warrior. The warrior, confident in his skills and knowledge, challenged the elder to a test. He held a small bird in his hands and asked, "Old man, is the bird alive or dead?" The elder looked at him and smiled. He knew that if he stayed alive, the warrior would crush the bird to prove him wrong. If he said dead, the warrior would release it. So the elder simply replied, "The answer is in your hands." The young warrior frowned, expecting a straightforward answer. But wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing when to listen, when to observe, and when to remain humble. Many of us, as we age, fall into the same trap as that young warrior. We assume that because we have lived long, we know all there is to know. But true wisdom is not about what we already understand. It's about our willingness to keep learning. I wasn't always the kindest man. I was respected, yes. Successful, absolutely. But kind? Patient? Open-minded? No. I can't say I was. I spent 4 decades as an engineer, solving problems, building things, and making decisions that mattered. When I spoke, people listened. I took pride in that. But when I retired, something changed. The world no longer revolved around me. The office phone stopped ringing, my opinion was no longer sought after, and suddenly I was just another old man in a world that had moved on without me. And I hated it. I still wanted to feel important, so I did what I had always done. I made sure everyone knew how much I knew. At family gatherings I talked at people instead of with them. If my son shared an idea, I'd correct him. If my granddaughter mentioned something she learned in school, I'd shake my head and say, "That's not how the real world works." I couldn't see it at the time, but my need to be right was driving them away. Then one day something happened that changed everything. It started with something small. A birthday gift. My grandson Jason handed me a box with a big grin. "It's a smartphone, Grandpa. Now you can text and video call us anytime." I forced a smile, but deep down I scoffed. "I don't need this," I muttered. "I've lived just fine without one." Jason's face fell for a second. Then he brightened. "It's easy. I'll teach you." I didn't want to admit it, but I had no idea how to use it. My fingers fumbled over the screen, tapping things I didn't mean to tap. The phone beeped and buzzed in ways I didn't understand. Jason tried to guide me, but frustration bubbled up inside me. "This thing is ridiculous," I snapped. "Back in my day, we didn't need all these gadgets." Jason gave me a small, sad smile. "I know, Grandpa, but back in your day, you didn't have a grandson who lived 3 states away, wishing he could see you more." I opened my mouth to argue, then I stopped. Because I saw it, the disappointment in his eyes. This wasn't about a phone. This was about connection, about staying part of his life, and I was throwing it away, because I was too proud to admit I needed help. That night I sat in my chair staring at the phone. I had spent my whole life priding myself on my intelligence, yet here I was, too stubborn to learn something new. Had my arrogance cost me more than just this moment? Had it cost me years of deeper relationships with my own family? The next morning I did something that went against every instinct I had. I knocked on Jason's door and said, "Teach me." I didn't grumble. I didn't roll my eyes. I just listened. And for the first time in a long time, I learned. It wasn't just about the phone. It was about realizing that my need to be right had made me blind to the world around me. I started seeing things differently. I saw how my son's face tensed up when I interrupted him, how my daughter-in-law hesitated before sharing her thoughts, already expecting me to dismiss them. I saw how my arrogance had turned me into a man they tolerated, rather than a man they enjoyed being around. So I made a change. The next time my granddaughter shared something new, I leaned in and listened instead of correcting her. When my son talked about his job, I asked questions instead of offering unsolicited advice. And when my grandson called me, on my new smartphone, I answered, smiling as his face filled the screen. "See, Grandpa, I knew you could learn," I chuckled. So did I. As I sit here now, reflecting on all those wasted years, I realize something. Arrogance isolates us. Humility connects us. Being right isn't what makes us wise. Being open is. The world is changing, the people around us are growing, and we have 2 choices. We can shut ourselves off, insisting we already know enough, or we can open our hearts and our minds and keep learning until our very last breath. Because the moment we think we know it all is the moment we stop truly living. Have you ever caught yourself dismissing new ideas, resisting change, or assuming you knew best, only to later realize you were wrong? Or maybe you know someone like I was, someone who refuses to listen, even when it costs them the people they love? Let's talk about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories, your experiences, they matter. And if this message resonated with you, hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe. Because wisdom isn't about what we already know. It's about the lessons we still have left to learn. Lack of empathy, failing to understand others. When people talk, listen completely. Most people never listen. Ernest Hemingway. There's an old story from the Native American Lakota tribe about a boy who went to his grandfather, frustrated and angry. "Grandfather, people don't understand me. They ignore my feelings and they never listen." The old man nodded and said, "Come with me." They walked to the river, and the grandfather threw a stone into the water. "Do you see the ripples?" The boy nodded. The stone does not ask the water to move, it simply drops, and the water responds. The way others treat us is often a reflection of how we treat them. If you wish to be understood, first, you must understand others. The boy frowned. "But what if they never listen?" The grandfather smiled. "Then be patient. Keep listening. In time they will hear." Too often we expect others to hear us, but we fail to listen ourselves. We dismiss their struggles, thinking they don't matter, or worse, that our experiences are more important. And in doing so, we push them away, brick by brick, until one day, we find ourselves alone. My name is Frank, and for most of my life, I thought I was a good man. I worked hard, provided for my family, and did everything I thought a husband, a father, and a grandfather should do. But there was one thing I didn't do. I didn't listen. I don't mean that I didn't hear people, I heard them just fine, but hearing isn't the same as listening. When my wife Eleanor used to tell me she felt lonely, I'd nod absent-mindedly, barely looking up from my newspaper. "That's just how life is," I'd say. "You're overthinking it." When my son David lost his job and came to me for advice, I told him to stop complaining and just work harder. When I was your age, I had 2 jobs and never whined about it. And when my granddaughter Emily confided in me that she was struggling with anxiety, I scoffed. Anxiety? Back in my day, we didn't have time for anxiety. "You kids are too soft." I thought I was giving wisdom. I thought I was helping, but all I was doing was making them feel unheard. At first, nothing seemed different. My family still invited me to dinner and still called me on occasion, but over time the invitations became fewer. The phone calls became shorter. I told myself they were just busy, that it wasn't personal. But deep down, I knew better. The real turning point came one Christmas. For the first time in 40 years, I spent Christmas Eve alone. My son had taken his family to his in-laws. My other relatives had made their own plans, and my house, once filled with laughter and noise, was silent. I sat at the dinner table, staring at an empty chair across from me, where Eleanor used to sit. She had passed a few years back, and I suddenly realized she had spent so many years feeling alone, and I had never really seen it. I picked up the phone and called David. "Hey son, just wanted to say Merry Christmas." There was a pause. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he said, his voice polite but distant. I swallowed hard. "I miss you." Another pause, then a sigh. "We miss you too, Dad, but sometimes talking to you feels hard. You never really listened to us." His words cut deeper than I expected. "What do you mean?" "I've always been here for you. Being here isn't the same as being present." And with that I understood. It took me a long time to admit my mistakes. I had spent my whole life talking and advising, assuming I knew best, but never truly listening. So I made a change. The next time Emily called, instead of dismissing her worries, I asked her to tell me more. I listened to her struggles with an open heart, without trying to fix or judge them. She cried, "Grandpa, this is the first time you've really heard me." When David called to talk about work, I didn't jump in with my own stories. I simply said, "That sounds tough. Tell me more." He exhaled. "Thanks, Dad. I just needed to say it out loud." And when I sat by Eleanor's grave, I whispered the words I wished I had said more when she was alive. "I hear you now." Empathy isn't about fixing people's problems. It's about acknowledging them. It's about letting someone feel seen, heard, and understood. For years, I had mistaken wisdom for authority. I thought my life experience meant I had the right to tell people how to feel. But real wisdom isn't about having the right answers. It's about asking the right questions. And sometimes the only question we need to ask is, how are you really doing? Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever dismissed someone's feelings, thinking they were overreacting? Or have you ever felt unheard by someone close to you? If so, I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because in the end, the most powerful thing we can offer each other isn't advice, it's understanding. 5. Fear of change, clinging to the familiar. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change. Charles Darwin. There's an old parable about a traveler who came across a wise elder sitting beside a river. The traveler was exhausted and asked the elder how to cross. The elder smiled and handed him a sturdy raft. The traveler used it to cross safely, thanking the elder before continuing on his journey. But after a while, the traveler began to struggle. He was still carrying the raft. He refused to let it go. "It helped me before, I can't abandon it now." But the weight of the raft slowed him down, burdening him. He clung to something he no longer needed, something that once saved him but now held him back. How often do we do the same? Holding on to the past, fearing that letting go means losing ourselves. But change isn't about forgetting the past. It's about making room for what's ahead. I was born in the same house where I grew old. I lived through every season of my life within those four walls. I raised my children there, watched my husband paint the front porch every summer, and memorized the way the afternoon light danced across the wooden floors. And then, life changed. My husband passed. My children grew up and moved away. One by one, the neighbors I had known for decades either passed on or left for warmer places. My once lively home became a house of echoes. And yet, when my son Michael gently suggested that I move closer to him and his family, I recoiled. "Mom, you're all alone out there. Wouldn't it be nice to be closer to us, to the grandkids?" I waved him off. "I don't need to change anything, Michael. This is my home. I'm fine." But the truth? I wasn't fine. I was lonely. I missed laughter in the kitchen, the chatter of loved ones filling the rooms. But leaving that house? It felt like erasing my past, like saying goodbye to everything that mattered. And so, I stayed. Even as the loneliness grew heavier, even as my health declined and simple tasks became difficult, even as I sat on my porch each night, looking at an empty street, wondering if I had made the right choice. Then one day, something happened that shattered my illusions. I had gone to the grocery store, the same one I had visited for years. As I walked down the aisles, I realized I didn't recognize anyone. The cashiers were new, the regulars I used to chat with were gone. I was a stranger in the very town I refused to leave, and for the first time I asked myself, what am I holding on to? Was it the house, the town, or was it just fear? Fear that if I left, my past would disappear. Fear that if I embraced something new, I would lose everything old. But as I looked around that store, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, I realized something painful. I had already lost what I was trying to hold on to. That night, I sat in my quiet house, and for the first time in years I let myself cry. A few weeks later, I called Michael. "Son, I think I'm ready to move." His relief was almost overwhelming. "Mom, that's wonderful. You won't regret it." But I wasn't so sure. Packing up my home was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Every object I touched held a memory. Every empty corner whispered stories of the past. I almost backed out a dozen times. But then, I arrived at my new home, just a few blocks from Michael's house. On my first night there, I sat alone in my unfamiliar kitchen. The air smelled different, the silence was new. I almost let fear take over, but then there was a knock on the door. It was my grandchildren. "Grandma, come see the backyard. We set up a chair for you by the fire pit." They pulled me outside, their small hands warm in mine. I sat by the fire, surrounded by their laughter, the night filled with stories and warmth. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't even realized I had lost: belonging. Looking back, I see now that I was never really afraid of moving. I was afraid of losing. I thought leaving my home meant leaving my memories behind, but I was wrong. Memories don't live in walls. They don't live in furniture or old familiar streets. They live inside us, and no matter where we go, they come with us. Since moving, I've found a new rhythm. My days are no longer filled with silence. My grandchildren visit often. We bake together. We sit on the porch as the sun sets. And you know what? I haven't lost my past. I've just made room for my future. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever resisted change, fearing what it might take away from you? Or have you ever embraced a change, only to realize later that it brought you something even better? Let's talk about it. Drop a comment below and share your experience. Your words, your wisdom, they matter. And if this story resonated with you, like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe, because life isn't about holding on to the past. It's about making space for the future. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: we never stop growing. Life isn't measured by how many years we've lived, but by how willing we are to keep learning, keep loving, and keep embracing change. We've talked about the habits that hold us back, the silent walls we build around ourselves. But the truth is, we hold the key to breaking free. So ask yourself, which habit have you seen in your own life? Maybe it's resistance to change or holding on to old grudges. Maybe it's the belief that you already have all the answers. Whatever it is, know this: it's never too late to rewrite your story. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which of these habits do you think is the hardest to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if this spoke to you, help me spread this message. Like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe, and turn on notifications so we can continue this journey together. Because the best chapters of your life, they're still waiting to be written.